Hello, I am Jenna Klinner, and for the last several years, I've had the privilege to work as a service coordinator for the Do It WISC team. I've worked on the team for about the past 8+ years now, and I've been in my current role as service coordinator since 2020. I've learned a ton while working with this amazing team. A lot of what I've learned has been through trial and error. In other words, I learned a lot of things the hard way. I'm here today to share with you some key lessons learned in hopes that your service journey gets a little bit easier. The following are changes that the WISC team made that were especially impactful um, for scaling and supporting the service offering. These items have allowed us to consistently grow the service while continuing to accommodate new features, building key automations, and offering top tier user support. Before I get started, I also want to note that service improvements will always be iterative. There's not a singular change that you can make that will suddenly make everything better. These things ebb and flow, and you must be willing to adapt with the changes. We're always learning new things over in WISC, and we use that info to help improve the way we do things over time. The important thing is just being really open to change. So with that, I will get started on my presentation called Improving the Scalability, Supportability, and Impact of Your Enterprise IT Services. Here's what we have on the lineup today. It's really just two pieces. The first is 5 changes that the service can make to improve supportability and scalability. And then the second is reviewing the impacts that these changes had on the WISC team. So let's get started. The first habit is narrowing scope. An error I consistently see IT teams making is to offer more and more services without taking anything off of their plate. Sometimes this is out of our hands, right? Leadership might require a team to include a new offering, an unexpected pandemic requires a team to take on a new tool, etc. However, this can and should be avoided where possible. So think of it this way. You know those restaurants with huge menus, the multi-page menus where it's almost overwhelming to find what you want to eat? Are any of these restaurants your favorite place to eat? Typically, no. Why? Because it's the quantity versus quality game. Will the food taste okay? Sure. Will it be the best experience of your life? Likely not. Uh, the reason is because it's not possible to offer so many things and do them all super well. There's always going to be something that suffers. The food quality might be lower, the facilities might not be as clean, the staff might be poorly trained, etc. Instead, focus on your most important offerings, what your users need and value the most. This is what the top chefs do. They offer a narrowed list of dishes, but they do them all superbly. Within WhiskWeb, we're willing to take things away if it means freeing up time to focus on higher priority tasks and more widely used features. This change takes some getting used to for sure, but over time it becomes a very normal habit and one that can have overwhelmingly positive impacts on your service. I don't want to give the impression that we're adding things and removing them from the service all the time. However, we do a healthy amount of inventorying what we're offering and surveying users on what they really need. Here's a great example of a major change that we made to narrow scope. WhiskWeb used to offer a service that would allow users to host intranet sites that were protected at the root. It was only utilized by 1% of our websites. However, it took a hefty amount of time, energy, and resources to keep it up and running. This offering also required us to support a single server that had to be manually patched every time updates rolled out. This created a bit of a security risk, and it was also a lot of work. After chatting with groups, we found that most did not know why their content needed to be protected. It was mostly info that was fine sharing publicly. Over the course of about 9 months, we met with groups using this setup and worked on alternative solutions. This differed depending on needs, but mostly it involved moving sites to our main web server setup. After 9 months, we were able to decommission the intranet server and free up a huge amount of staff time to work on higher priority features. So why is this important? I can give you so many reasons, but here's a couple of the more noteworthy ones. Number one, narrowing scope means that you have more time to spend on your most valued services and continue to grow and improve them over time. This is a change that can be so widely felt. You'll also have more time for support documentation, one-on-one help, new feature development, troubleshooting, etc. Number two, it makes your purpose so much clearer to your users, which means you'll gather more users who need exactly what you're offering. Your reputation then improves, more folks will be talking about what you offer, and this naturally leads to growth in all the right areas. And number three, it also means that you can make upgrades to your service without being held back by a particular group. Remember that intranet server example I gave earlier? Without making that change, our team wouldn't have been able to work on other projects or not as easily because we'd always have to worry about how those changes might have impacted that 1% of users. After we decommissioned the intranet server, we were able to more easily move from a network load balancer setup to an application load balancer. We were able to roll out key updates without having to focus on two different server styles. We were also able to focus on more highly needed protection needs that were more supportable and secure, and will continue to benefit from this change over time. The steps for narrowing your service scope are relatively simple. Basically, you'll want to first assess your portfolio. What are you offering now? What are people using the most? What do they see the most value in? And what is the business need for this feature? Then ask yourself if the amount of effort involved is consistent with the number of users utilizing that feature. If it doesn't add up, work towards discontinuing those features over time if it makes sense. I know that in reality, it's not that simple. So I'll offer these tips. You'll want to do some user research. Surveys and interviews are great ways of gaining a better understanding of user needs. Sometimes services are not widely used now because they're not well designed. Gathering user feedback helps you understand how necessary those features are. Another option is to offer as much time as possible for your users to migrate to another alternative. In our research, we found that 6 months is a minimum amount of time that you want to propose for folks. Also, survey your users to understand if there's a time of year that works best for them in terms of making major changes. Sometimes summer is best for groups because students are mostly gone. However, some groups are busier in the summer due to events like SOAR and fiscal year close. And finally, communicate a lot. Users typically don't read the first or even the third email. Offer different ways of hearing about the change. Consider emails and other avenues like an article on your website, a notification in your service dashboard, a Teams message via a community of practice group, etc. If possible, meet with your users in person or virtually to chat through questions and concerns. So in the last slide, I touched on how I recommend you getting started with narrowing scope. This did touch on the user piece a bit, but I want to dig into this a little bit deeper as I know the user experience is one of those areas that probably intimidates teams the most when removing service offerings. As I mentioned, it is vitally important that you communicate with your users about the change so that they are aware that it is coming. Here's some other tips for managing user expectations during times of change. First, provide a rationale for the change. We're all humans. We understand that there are limitations to what can be accomplished by small service teams. Be honest about the why behind your decision. WhiskWeb had to make a change last year that required us to remove a WordPress plugin that was very beloved. It wasn't something that we wanted to take away, but the newer version literally broke our websites. We spent a lot of time explaining this experience to our users. While they were still upset that it was going away, they understood that there was no way around it. Number two, offer opportunities to gather feedback. This is especially important if you sense that the change could be very impactful to the day-to-day operations for your users. We can assume we understand the impact a change might have, but until you survey those impacted, you'll never know for sure. Gathering feedback allows you to see things from their perspective. This offers an opportunity for you to include their unique needs in future service offerings and allows you to identify trends and themes for use of your tooling. And number three, let your users know that you've got their back. They want to know that you're going to be there for them throughout the process. Make sure that they feel heard and supported. Note what you're going to do to make the change as streamlined as possible for them. All right, we're on to habit number 2, which is swarming challenges as a team. This was a super simple change that we made in the WhiskWeb team that had really awesome impacts. In IT, there's always going to be things that come up that are just sticky. They are difficult to understand, challenging to troubleshoot, or just big, ugly projects that can be hard to wrap your head around. For these tasks, I highly recommend swarming as a team. Getting more brains in the room helps move these challenges and projects forward. And when you unblock those really sticky issues, you can open the floodgates to new service possibilities. Last year, the WhiskWeb team found the HT-access files between our dev, QA, and prod environments were not identical. This meant that when we rolled out changes, we couldn't guarantee that the experience would be the same between our environments, and our testing of upgrades was not accurate. We decided to work on these files as a team, partially because it is sort of a dry, annoying process that no one really wants to have to do, and partly because there was ample discovery involved. We started by removing code that was no longer needed or relevant. We would make the changes in dev, test them there first, then QA, and then prod. Next, we started digging into syntax and learning more about best practices for Apache. We updated the existing code to align with current standards and deployed through the environments the very same way. The result was that we had more perfectly mirrored htaccess files between environments, and we reduced the risk of something working in one environment and not another. This work also made the files so much easier to follow and interpret. Swarming issues as a team has some incredible benefits. Number one, cross-team training and shared understanding of the issue. Your team will be learning with each new issue you tackle. It's not forced, it happens naturally. Do you think I understood the differences between files and files match before we swarmed the htaccess cleanup? Heck no. But now I kind of get it, and I can at least follow along while our team talks about these types of changes. Number two, improved team member confidence. This ties very closely to number one. When you understand difficult concepts better, you're more apt to jump into troubleshooting and feel more confident discussing these topics. It's a great feeling, especially when you're making a decision on a difficult topic. And number three, quicker time to resolution. With challenging projects, it could take a single person several weeks or even months to figure things out. When you've got a couple of brains in the room, you can resolve issues much more quickly, sometimes within just an hour. Also, these big sticky issues won't keep building up and becoming more of a barrier. You're getting them resolved as they're discovered. So how do we swarm on the WhiskWeb team? We have a recurring team swarm session every other week. Essentially, we dedicate 1 hour every 2 weeks to this level of team collaboration. For this, this is enough for us. This is enough to help unstick issues and keep moving things forward. We also maintain a backlog specifically of tasks that we might want to swarm. This way, we don't lose track of things, and there's always ample number of things that we can chat about in those sessions. All right, habit number 3. It's a little challenging to explain, but I'm going to call this the keep customer setup consistent tip. And what do I mean by this? To the best of your ability, offer your user base the same suite of services. The more you accommodate one-off requests, the harder it is to build a scalable and supportable service. Custom setups require specific documentation, can create barriers with process improvements and new development, are time consuming to support. The list goes on and on. I'll offer an example here to better explain some of the barriers. The WISQM team used to allow complete customization of a website upon request. We would develop special website themes or templates that included anything that the users wanted. What was the result? Well, we spent hours and hours building functionality that ended up never getting used by the client. We were creating websites that didn't align with the campus brand, accessibility standards, etc. We were spending a lot of time troubleshooting bugs as every site was completely different. We couldn't easily patch things like PHP without a whole lot of testing, new code development and pain, and so many more things. So we've stopped taking on new custom development, and instead we now focus on adding new features into the base UW theme where appropriate. This has freed up a ton of time and energy for our team and allowed us to align our service so much more closely with brand and accessibility standards. Keeping the customer setup consistent has the following benefits. First, your team will be able to build automation so much more easily because the workflow should work for everyone. You no longer have to consider custom setups or scenarios. Number two, troubleshooting becomes so much easier when you don't have to remember that one group has something set up just slightly differently. And number three, say goodbye to scenarios where we put off a really cool new feature or an upgrade because it will break something for just one or two groups. This level of innovation becomes so much easier when the customer setup is consistent. What are some things that can benefit you here? What steps can you take to keep your setups more consistent? Well, first, do some discovery into what your average customer requires so that you're making their needs your focus. We do surveys both at the service and the unit level. We also regularly gather feedback in our lunch and learn sessions. Number two, make a feature request board for your service so that you're building new features based on broad needs rather than custom one-off requests. We use GitLab for this. It has nice upvote features and it's an easier way to track new requests. And number three, create transparency around changes you want to make and how they will benefit the service. Communicate with your users so they don't feel blindsided by changes. Remember that child theme example that I gave earlier? When users ask for custom development, we're very upfront about this limitation. But recognizing the potential barriers, we offer content strategy tips to help accommodate the needs that they have in ways that are more supported in the standard service offering. In most cases, this actually satisfies the initial need. We have found that most groups just weren't aware that their need could be accommodated in other ways. I'll also just mention here that narrowing scope also helps in this regard. When you let go of one-off offerings, you naturally move towards more consistent setups. Habit number 4 is don't sleep on technical debt. I see so many teams putting off technical debt only to have it bite them in the butt later. I recognize it isn't always easy to work on tech debt, and it shouldn't necessarily be something that you're always prioritizing. However, I can confidently say from experience that you will never regret shoring up your tech debt. Why? Because small tasks can become big issues and big barriers over time. Instead of giving an example of how we remove technical debt, I'll give an example of what can happen when you don't consider it. I think it's more impactful in explaining some of the benefits here. Back in 2020, our team was working on a new process for handling SSL certificates. We were using InCommon and the certs did not auto-renew, which meant that we had to manually renew a ton of certs every few months. Each one took at least 15 minutes. We had around 1,600 WISC websites at the time. We wanted to automate this to free up our capacity a bit and decrease the amount of time that the whole process took. We ultimately moved things to the AWS Certificate Manager and created a custom workflow within the tool that we dubbed Cert Shepherd. It has been a really great improvement over the past process and has allowed us to spend so much less time on website launches as a result. However, the journey was a bit painful. Because we didn't have this strong site decommissioning process in place, we ended up spending time moving over SSL certs for sites that no longer existed within the service. Had we cleaned up this technical debt before we started the project by having a better site decommissioning process in place, we would have been able to complete the setup sooner and spent less hassle getting everything migrated. Okay, so I touched on this a little bit already, but there's some really great benefits of always slowly chipping away at tech debt. First, as is apparent from my example, it creates less barriers when you want to start a new project, automation, process improvement tasks, etc. You'll be able to jump into them right away without cleaning up a bunch of messy tech debt first. This makes your team more agile and efficient. Second, you'll have fewer unpredictable issues. Tech debt can cause such random barriers for teams, especially when there's a lot of it or it's coming from several different areas. These can become even harder to resolve over time and can take much more effort. And finally, you'll ultimately be providing your users with a better user experience. Why? Well, when your team regularly cleans up technical debt, you're able to produce more and deliver better products. You'll also have more capacity for user help and support. So how do you remove technical debt? This is sort of two-part. Ideally, you're not having to spend your entire sprints just on tech debt. Instead, you're chipping away at it slowly over time. And here's how you can get started. First, always document your technical debt tasks. If you've finished a project and you know there's tech debt as a result, make a ticket and note everything that you know about it. If you find some technical debt, document it. Before you start a project, note any technical debt that you know will result and make time in your roadmap to complete it. Make it part of your normal planning process and project timelines. And second, make a point to include technical debt as a regular category in your roadmap. This doesn't mean that you always have to have tech debt assigned to each sprint. However, it does mean you should be tackling technical debt with each quarter of the year, even if it's just one small task. You will never stop thanking yourself for making this your new norm. All right, and habit number 5, Marie Kondo your sprint backlog. Marie Kondo is an organizational consultant for a hit Netflix show called Tidying Up. Marie helps people declutter their homes in order to move forward in their lives and feel happy and comfortable in their spaces. She accomplishes this through a couple different techniques, but one of them is a question that she poses to homeowners, which is, does this item spark joy? When I say that you should Marie Kondo your sprint backlog, I'm not exactly asking you to assess whether or not you like a certain task or project, but there is immense value in assessing whether or not a ticket is actually worth remaining in your backlog. Therefore, a better question might be, is this a priority right now? To restate this habit in those terms, close out any non-priority sprint tasks. This is one that is going to alarm some folks, and I'm here to say everything will be okay. I'm not suggesting that you delete these tasks. Create them. Add all known info to the ticket, but be open to closing them for the time being in order to focus on higher priority tasks. It's challenging to give an example of the impacts of decluttering the backlog. Instead, I'll share an example of a drastic change that we made to declutter our backlog and how it was fully okay. We were totally fine. Back in 2019, our team was using Jira for tracking sprint issues and tasks. Our practice at that time was to create a ticket for anything that came in, but we didn't have a process in place for managing all of those tickets. Over time, we had hundreds of backlog tasks, and it became pretty overwhelming. When we moved our work from Jira to GitLab, we only recreated the tasks that were of the utmost importance. Everything else stayed in Jira. This was a test to see what was really needed. We decided that we would recreate other tickets as needed, like if we found something was a priority and we didn't realize it, or if something became more of a priority over time. In 4 years, we only had to move one ticket over. That's not to say that having those documented issues in JIRA weren't helpful, but only one was important enough that we had to recreate it in our GitLab sprint board. Now stick with me because there are some really great benefits to closing out non-priority backlog tickets. First, your team will be able to stay more focused on the most important tasks. A clean backlog provides so much less noise for your team to get distracted by. And for service leads and product owners, it's much easier to do sprint planning when you don't have to review hundreds of backlogged items. Second, your team will have an easier time creating and adhering to your roadmap. Roadmaps can be a daunting challenge for many teams. Some are not even at the point where they can plan several sprints out. This issue is compounded when you're considering an extra large backlog. And third, this change will really improve your sprint planning cycles. It will be more obvious what issues take priority, and you'll have an easier time road mapping and planning your sprints. The final portion of the presentation is sharing some real impacts of these changes and what impact they had on the Whisk Web team. So I kind of gave you 5 tips here for what we changed, and now I want to share what impact that had for us. Last year, I was asked to provide some data to explain the impacts of these changes that we made, and I've chosen to start with qualitative data because I believe it to be so much more powerful at explaining the differences. Here's a shortened list of what we've been able to accomplish because of these changes that we made. First, we've been able to discontinue features of our service offering without it having a major impact on our number of customers. Our service has grown from about 180 websites to over 2,000 websites in only a few short years. Second, we can more easily drop everything to work on unplanned or emergency tasks without it impacting our efficiency. Years ago, the Whisk Web team had no roadmap and was consistently pivoting based on whatever came in. It was an incredibly inefficient way to work, but more importantly, it meant that emergency issues became major challenges for the team. Now, as unplanned work comes in, we can quickly jump in or plan it within our roadmap. And a noteworthy side effect to this is that our staff is also doing much less context switching. Number 3, our team has been able to focus very heavily on both accessibility and security. I mention this because I know these things feel like a luxury for many services, and I'm telling you that it is not only possible, but it can become a natural way for you to work. Number 4, we consistently have time in our roadmap for things like automation, new feature development, process improvement, and technical debt tasks. This means that the service is always evolving and improving for the better. Number 5, I mentioned already that the team used to operate with no roadmap, no sprint plan, etc. We now plan several sprints out and collaborate on a strong roadmap for each quarter. We also set fiscal year goals and are able to accomplish most of what we set out to do. Anything that doesn't get accomplished is typically deprioritized for a certain reason or is just an ongoing project. Speaking of the old days, we used to spend an entire day planning out our work week. Every Tuesday, our team would meet in a room and sit there all day to do planning for the week. Now we spend 30 minutes on sprint planning every week. And the great thing is we're getting way more done. Our team is now able to dedicate more time every year on continuous learning and upskilling in support of technological advances for the service. We have less work in progress now. Rather than opening a bunch of projects simultaneously, we're able to focus on a few and follow those through to completion before starting anything new. And finally, we are now able to provide faster and more efficient service to our users. All right, so you've heard my qualitative data, the stories that I think are powerful justifications for making some changes. But now y'all are probably interested in some quantitative data too. Therefore, here's some tasty quantitative nuggets for you to dine on. In fiscal year 23, the Whisk Web team onboarded an average of 15 to 20 new websites per month. We completed 300 plus issues and tasks in our sprint board. We fulfilled at least 15 requests from our feature request board. This did not include new features that we created that were unrelated to the feature request board. We made at least 10 accessibility improvements to the UW theme and the service. We rolled out 7 different UW theme versions. We closed 60 plus child themes that were no longer in use, so that's a little tech debt piece. And we decommissioned 2 unneeded multi-site environments, which doesn't sound like a lot, but was a big deal for our team. This drastically reduced both technical debt and support load. So to recap, there are 5 things that you can do to improve the supportability and scalability of your IT service. First, narrow service scope by focusing on high priority items. Second, swarm difficult challenges as a team. Third, keep customer setup consistent to limit support-related complexities. Fourth, always include technical debt in your service roadmap so that items don't become barriers for you later down the road. And fifth, keep your backlog clean by closing tickets that aren't currently in scope. I realize that this is a recorded session, but this is where I'd normally pause to ask questions of the audience. If you have any follow-up questions for me, please feel free to reach out to me at my email address listed here on the slide. It is jenna.klinner@wisc.edu. I would love to hear from you. Thank you all.